Welcome to Three Witches and a Druid podcast, a Canadian podcast about paganism in today's modern society. And now, Three Witches and a Druid podcast presents The Traveling Bard, Hobbs.
The story is called Siflar and the Magic Fiddler. Now this story takes place in Quebec, in a time in Quebec when it was very dangerous to live here, because everyone knew that the devil himself walked the roads of Quebec looking for souls to steal. And of all the souls he could get his hands on, the one that he prized the most were the souls of the people of Sainte Agathe. Because in Sainte Agathe, they were the most pious people in all of Quebec. Oh, the priest there, he was a busy man and he was a happy man. And so, in Sainte Agathe, there was a little girl named Siflar. And she was a rambunctious little 14-year-old girl, moi. If there was a party going on in Sainte Agathe, you could be sure that Siflar was there celebrating it. If there was a game going on in town, you could be sure that Siflar was there winning it. And if there was a fight going on in town, you could be sure that Siflar was there ending it. Now, Siflar loved living in Sainte Agathe because they celebrated all the holidays with so much enthusiasm. She loved Christmas, and she loved Easter, and she loved Thanksgiving. But of all the holidays they celebrated in Sainte Agathe, the one that she loved the most was the celebration of Mardi Gras, Fat Tuesday, the day before Ash Wednesday, before the beginning of Lent. Now in Quebec, when people celebrate Mardi Gras, it is tradition to have a huge meal. Everyone comes together, they eat their fill, and then when that's done, then they put the tables away and they bring out the fiddler and he starts to play, and the people dance and they celebrate. But all of this has to stop at midnight. Because if you're caught celebrating after midnight, well then the devil could take your soul. So it was that one year the people of Sainte Agathe were getting ready to celebrate Mardi Gras as they had every other year. But the night before Mardi Gras, old Henri Bourboin, the local town fiddler, he passed away. And without a fiddler, well, they couldn't have any music. And of course, all the other musicians had gigs that night to celebrate Mardi Gras. And the people of Sainte Agathe decided, well, if there's no fiddler, there's no music. If there's no music, there's no dancing. And if there's no dancing, well, there's no point in having a huge celebration. So everyone in Sainte Agathe decided that they were going to have a quiet Mardi Gras celebration in their own homes. Everyone except for Siflar. Because Siflar, she loved the celebration of Mardi Gras. She loved the music. She loved the dancing. She loved the food. And if all they needed was a musician, well, then she was going to find one. And so when the teacher wasn't looking, she crawled out of a window of the schoolhouse and she went down to the crossroads. Now, a crossroads was a place between the towns where people came and they exchanged bits of news. They did a little bit of bartering. There was lots of gossiping going on. All sorts of things were happening. And Siflar went down to the crossroads and she hid herself in the bushes. And she waited and she watched. And all of a sudden, she noticed two young women who were speaking. And one of them said, "Did you hear? There's a young musician looking for a place to play for Mardi Gras celebrations." "Really?" said the second girl. "Is he talented?" "Is he talented?" said the first girl. "Well, I've never heard him play, but they say that when he puts bow to fiddle, it's the most beautiful music that you've ever heard. He wears a colorful scarf around his waist, and the music is so enchanting that the scarf seems to dance to the music as if it had a mind of its own." Well, that's all Siflar needed to hear. And she watched up and down that road looking for that young man. And of course, she saw him walking towards her with a fiddle underneath his arm and a colorful sash tied around his waist. As soon as he walked near where she was hiding, she stepped out onto the road and she stopped him right there. And she said, "I am Siflar of Sainte Agathe, and I have come to invite you to play your fiddle for our Mardi Gras celebrations." Now, the fiddler was surprised to be addressed by such a young girl, but he cocked his head to the side and he said, "I would be honored to play for a place as famous and as pious as Sainte Agathe." And so Siflar took him by the scarf and she led him back to the town. Now, Siflar expected a hero's welcome there. They were going to have a boring Mardi Gras celebration, and now, thanks to her, they had a musician. Because they had a musician, they could have music, they could have dancing, and celebrate this holiday properly. But instead, she got in trouble from her parents for having left the school without permission. Of course, she got in trouble with the elders for leaving the school without permission. And instead of being able to celebrate, she was shut in the priest's house with all the other children, while the adults, of course, who welcomed the fiddle player, they were making preparations for that night. Siflar was beside herself with rage. All that hard work, and now she was going to miss the party anyways. So when the priest wasn't looking, nobody locked their windows in this town. She crawled out of a window of the priest's house, and she went down to the church hall. And she went around the back, she looked into the kitchen, and she could see the people making the food. There was tourtière, and there was pudding chômeur, and they even had lamb stew. Coincidentally, they have lamb stew here tonight. And they had all this beautiful food, and her mouth was watering. And then she went over to the side of the church hall, and she looked in through the windows, and she could see everyone was getting the place ready, putting up streamers and balloons and laying out the tables and putting the tablecloths on. And that's when she heard an odd sound. It was a blinking sound. And she looked over, and she could see the fiddler sitting there on the fence, plucking at the strings. And he plucked at the first string, blink, blink, plunk, it broke. He pulled the old string from the fiddle, dropped it on the ground, pulled a new string from his pocket, and restrung the fiddle. He plucked at the second string, blink, blink, plunk, it broke. He pulled the old string from the fiddle, dropped it on the ground, pulled a new string from his pocket, and restrung the fiddle. He plucked at the fourth string, blink, blink. He plucked at the third string, blink, blink, plunk, it broke. He pulled the old string from the fiddle, dropped it on the ground, pulled a new string from his pocket, and he restrung the fiddle. Now, Siflar was just about to go over and speak to him when suddenly he stood up, put the fiddle underneath its arm, and he walked into the church hall. And as Siflar watched him go, she could hear her name being called. Siflar, Siflar. She looked around, she thought maybe one of the adults had seen her, so she dove into a bush, but there was no one in sight. Still, she could hear her name being called. Siflar, Siflar. She looked down and she realized that the voices were coming from the strings that were on the ground. And she picked them up, and they were strangely warm to the touch, and they glowed with their own light. "Who are you?" she said. "Siflar," said the strings, "we are lost souls, for that is no ordinary fiddle player, but the devil himself. Tonight, when he plays his fiddle for your town, he will cast a spell upon the people, and he will make them dance, dance, dance past midnight, and then he will take their souls." And Siflar was terrified. The devil was in their town, and she was the one that brought him there. "What can I do?" she said. Then the string spoke and said, "Tonight, when he plays his fiddle, you must take us and you must throw us underneath his feet, and that will break the spell upon the town." And Siflar wept. Now that night, they had a grand old feast. There was all the newest of food and the oldest of drink. They brought out all the best food. People ate to their fill, and when they were done, they pushed away from the tables. I know it looks like I just came from there, doesn't it? And when they were done, they took all the tables and stacked them up in the corner, threw a tablecloth over them, and they brought out a chair. And the fiddler sat down in it, and he put bow to fiddle, and he began to play. The slow, sorrowful song. And it hushed the crowd. And the men and the women, when they heard that fiddle playing, they were moved to tears. And then the tempo changed. And jigs and reels started pouring out of that fiddle. And as soon as the people heard the music, they couldn't help themselves. They jumped up and they began to dance. And they whirled around that room. There were men with women and women with men, men with men and women with women, and they began to dance like mad around that church hall. And Siflar, who was hidden in the corner underneath all of those tables, she could feel the floor vibrating beneath her feet as they danced. And even though she was protected by the magic of the strings, she had to admit it was the most beautiful music that she had ever heard. The people danced in a mad fury, and hours passed. So finally Siflar, hidden under those tables, suddenly, she noticed the floor stopped vibrating. She looked out from underneath the tablecloth, and there she could see the people were still dancing, whirling around in a mad fury around that church hall. And there in the corner she could see the fiddle player, and he was playing his fiddle, and his scarf was weaving and dancing as if it had a mind of its own. But the people started to rise higher and higher in the air, and they danced on nothing. And Siflar knew that it must almost be midnight. So she gathered up her courage. She took the strings, and she ran out straight for the fiddle player, and his eyes were red, and they seemed to be on fire, and black smoke began to pour out of the fiddle. She took the strings, she threw them beneath his feet, and he screamed as if he had stepped on knives, and everyone who was dancing in the air, they fell to the ground. And they looked up and they saw Siflar standing there, and they knew how close they had come to losing their souls to the devil that very night. And everyone turned and they looked at the fiddle player, and he was still playing that fiddle. But now it was his turn, and he started to rise higher and higher in the air, and his scarf was weaving and dancing in tune to the music as if it had a mind of its own. And he rose higher and higher in that room, and when it looked like he was about to hit his head on the ceiling, he passed right through it as if he were a ghost. The people came out of the church hall and they watched as the devil, playing his fiddle, rose higher and higher in the air, and just before he was lost from sight, he cocked his head to the side, and he laughed, and he disappeared. Now, if you ever go to Saint Agathe, right around the time of Mardi Gras, look up in the night sky, and if you're lucky, maybe you will see the devil's scarf weaving and dancing in the sky. Of course, we call those things the Northern Lights, but now you know what they really are. And if you listen very carefully, you will hear the devil playing his fiddle, and you will have to admit, it's the most beautiful music that you have ever heard.
Hello, and welcome back to Three Witches and a Druid, where we sit around the kitchen table with a warm beverage. This time it was a lovely mulled wine cocktail.
It's called the Reaper.
Yes.
Oh, the Reaper, really?
The Reaper, yeah.
It's
and
delicious.
we talk about our lives as modern pagans, which apparently mulled red wine is part of. I'm Margot.
And I'm Maeve.
I'm Gwen.
And I'm Brian. I often feel that we should start these episodes off by saying, like, we are not experts. These are merely opinions of four individuals sitting around the coffee table. I just listened to another podcast, and they were like, we are not detectives. We are merely two guys sitting in a basement.
Yes.
Talking into a microphone. So we thought we'd do a bit of a 3, maybe 4-part series about nature spirits, ancestors, and the shining ones, or deities. In Druidry, there is a 4th. We call them the Outdwellers, which has been brought up in conversation a lot in Druidic circles. We're going to start off this evening with nature spirits. Now, nature spirits is drastically different for every path, I'm sure. It could be very different for every person. I just wanted to talk about what do you guys view as nature spirits in your paths, in your belief system?
So we have a big blank, and I think maybe part of it, I was thinking about this when Brian suggested this. I think in some ways we need some definitions. There's some framework, because it is a broad yes. topic. And I have an idea of what I consider nature spirits, and maybe it kind of follows two very distinct tracks. But I picked up, I have Judith Illish's Encyclopedia of Spirits, and she doesn't even have nature spirits because it's such a broad topic. You want, it's broken down. Even Druids here on this land, this Nova Scotia, when you speak of nature spirits, what do you refer to?
Well, once again, in Druidry, it's the broadest of the 3. It can encompass creatures of the land, fur, feather, be it animals, be it the folk of the Fae, be it any creature that lives here on this land.
Would you consider yourself a nature spirit? Because you're a creature who lives on the land. Well, we don't. We live in houses. Or are you talking about nature?
Anybody and anything. Yeah, I guess in a way you could view other people as nature spirits, but it should be a little bit more specific.
Mm-hmm.
I think we all know one or two people who are definitely
That is a very good point. They're not of society, they are of the wild. But yeah, no, it is a very broad topic. It's not specific. And I think one of the things that brought it up for me, and we've discussed this in a past episode, is the more modern focus of social media and fairy magic.
No fairies.
Yeah, I'm getting
No, maybe
side-eye here
don't
from me.
do fairies. Anyway, we'll get into that later. No fairies.
No, well, I guess you could talk about that right now. This is a
Well,
good time.
for first, I will say nature spirits. I see that as a nature spirit. I even see the elements because the
Yeah.
I was
elements.
going to say, as
Yes,
an element,
definitely.
and indeed,
Element, and I see anything that again is of the earth and radiates with the earth and gets their energy from the earth. I see that as even, the tree has a spirit, rocks have a spirit. There are the Fae. I absolutely do not deny that they're there. I just don't do them. The Fae, in my mind, and in anybody who's had any experience with them, and I do not have much experience with them because I've seen too many people have experiences with them. They're tricky. People say, many people work with the fairy and all of that, and I respect them. But I don't invite them into my house.
No.
If you decide you want to go to a fairy well or a fairy mound and give some silver or crystals or whatever, make a deal with them, you better have a 10-page notarized contract because it will come to you in ways you never expected. That's why I don't do fairies.
No.
I really don't. Or even if some people, I'm going to feed the fairies, you start feeding the fairies and you stop feeding the fairies, and then things are not necessarily as pleasant in your house as you would like.
Right.
So, though I respect them, no fairies. Has nobody seen Spiderwick? Seriously. Everybody thinks the Fae are, people think it's Tinkerbell.
No.
Not even.
Tinkerbell has a temper. Let's be honest.
She did have a temper. She was a jealous fairy. Very, very jealous.
But you're right.
Yeah, anything that, anything, trees and rocks and animals. It's interesting when you said animals being nature spirits. I never really considered animals nature spirits. I considered them of nature.
Yeah.
But not spirits. I mean, now we do have, spirit animals and this and that
that's
and the
what was going
concept.
to be my question. Do
Yeah.
you consider your spirit guides and your spirit animals to be nature spirits?
I think I consider them to be more literal than that.
Mm-hmm.
More literal than spirits.
Mm.
I can see them more as
As
the actual
individual
personalities.
personalities.
Yeah. Absolutely. Isn't that interesting? I never gave it much thought, but now that I may to. No, they're individual personalities. Absolutely. I never thought of them as that way. Isn't that interesting?
So one of the things I was wondering is very much what you're saying as a primarily animist, just because I do believe that trees and rocks and animals all have a sentience of their own, whether we understand it or not, and a being and a personhood. And I also recognize that they have species-specific characteristics. If you've had a dog, all dogs, even if you're loyal to a breed, and you replace a dog with a Labrador, with another lab, they all have their own personalities.
Mm-hmm.
So that is my understanding of those persons of nature, I think sometimes, and I go way out on a limb, and please correct me, either listener or around the table here, but sometimes when you're reading Indigenous tales from this land, they'll speak to bear with a small b, but there's also bear with a capital B. And I think often maybe when they go to bear and talk, they're maybe speaking to the spirit of all bear. the nature of bear. And sometimes they run across a bear, and that's designated as something separate. It's an individual because it has a small b in the stories. They go to mountain and they speak to an essence of mountain or whatever. So yeah, we have personalities and individuals, but then we have maybe egregores that we interact with as mountain or bear or whatever. And I trample on a culture that I don't really understand other than from the reading that I've done. But I think we kind of all can do that from time to time in our own ways.
Well, isn't that interesting that you say that? Because this is making me have all these epiphanies sitting right here.
Okay.
Is when you were saying my spirit animal, my spirit family, and the animals in my spirit family, I see them as individuals. But if you look in, any sort of book or whatnot that you use, call on bear when you need, when this and that. So if I was going to call on an animal that is not in my personal family, I would call on the spirit of the animal. Isn't that interesting? Because where my spirit animals to me are individuals with definite personalities, where if I was going to say, call on the spirit of shark, it would be the spirit of shark, not an individual shark. Isn't that individual? Isn't that interesting?
Yeah,
very
exactly.
interesting.
So,
geez, I'm gonna have to think on that tonight.
And
after more of this wine,
how does that change that relationship? That's a very interesting thing. My second thing is, my best reference is pop culture field. So individual nature spirits, like the Fae, there's very large families of other folk within different cultures, right? And here we live in this new, raw, upstart land, and it's not been homogenous, but a First Nations background. So families of cultures sort of thing that are similar, and a similar way of interacting with the land, not in an exact way from First Nation to First Nation. And then our ancestors, at least our cultural ancestors. I mean, my ancestors came a couple of decades ago, really, not that long ago to this country, but our cultural ancestors came. And I wonder American Gods like, because I really feel things live in their stories. That's how when, people pass, we say what remembers lives, and we remember them through story. So they were not genius loci. They were not of this land, but people have interactions now on this land, especially this eastern coast, of specific things that were traditionally thought of as being possibly European other folk, European nature spirits and fae. That is not the nature spirits that the original inhabitants of this land knew. So we brought them in story, we brought them in spirit or whatever, and they now populate this land as well. It's confusing and interesting to me and curious, and
it's I understand what you're saying is like there are already nature spirits here on the land that we've now begun to populate. There's always that thought, though, that various spirits or beings traveled over with.
In story or in actuality. Actuality on...
Right. But understanding that, not that there's necessarily a difference, but there are definitely nature spirits here long before anyone else arrived.
And so when we, on this continent, if I say, and I can remember Maeve being in your basement many decades ago, we were doing a study group of book study type stuff, and I remember a man telling us about his wife seeing a spirit, another folk, downtown Halifax. And it had a very Russian feel to with the way he described it. Now, I don't have a cultural tie to that. I don't have whatever, but I see it, I recognize it. You know what I mean? Like, neither did his family have a Russian tie, but that's what she saw on Barrington Street or whatever. We're just a land of immigrants planted here, and how do we interact with all of these different things? It's really interesting, and it's really can be problematic.
I have two things about
that.
I do know somebody else who has many times seen an actual leprechaun downtown Halifax.
Yes, and also a leprechaun. More than once,
Yeah, anyway, but here's the thing that I suppose I thought it, but I didn't think it. And this is the first time I'm saying it out loud because it may not be a popular opinion.
Yep.
Is there truly any difference? Because if you look, hold on here. If you look around the world, this all gods are one god, all gods are one goddess, on and on. You look around the world, everybody has a Diana and Artemis, something similar, every single culture.
Agreed, yeah.
They all have this. So here, would a spirit of a forest actually be any different, except for in the face we have put on them, than a spirit of a forest in Germany?
No, I believe that they're all...
Because, they're all connected to the earth.
We change through our own perspective.
We do change.
In our stories, our stories.
And our culture. But is it truly any different? We may say, and I'm not trying to cause any trouble here. This is just devil's advocate. But
which you hate being.
I hate being. I hate being. So there's a fox in England, and there's a fox in the native, here before Europeans arrived. Is that fox spirit any different in the First Nations thoughts? Really, is the spirit itself at its essence any different than the spirit of a fox in a forest in England?
I think the spirit of the fox in the First Nations is probably a lot calmer because it hasn't been hunted by assholes.
Yeah, there's that.
Tree.
But what I'm trying to say is there really any difference? Honestly, is there any difference in the spirit of a bear, the bear that had lived in Nova Scotia for 80,000 years to the bear that has lived in Russia for 80,000 years?
The only difference you're going to run into is the interaction that spirit may have had with the people of the land.
That's right. Anyone read Clan of the Cave Bear? They had all of that, back when you read that 35 years ago.
So when you hear stories...
I think it's all the same sort of thing, just different face on
the fox here in North America may be more of a trickster than the one in Europe, but that's just because of interactions. That's not necessarily the character.
But then you read Aesop's fable, and foxes are sly and can be tricksy and that sort of thing. But you're right. Along those same lines, stepping just a little bit away from nature spirits. Several years ago, my father had a major back surgery, and he did everything allopathic medicine required of him, and like many people had a lot of pain, and he had 3 different healing touch people come in, which was kind of a step outside his comfort zone, not by choice. He just chose healing touch people out of, I don't know, the Yellow Pages, whatever. And they all had different cultural. One was Reiki, one what called themselves maybe quantum touch, and one was happened to be First Nations. They all said they saw specific things that they described the same around him, certain light beings, and one called them guardian angels, and one called them something else. They all had a different name for them. And yet they had the same description, and he was the same patient, and they didn't know each other.
Right.
So
it is all the same thing, but
it is
different
in science. There is that thing in science where things change having to do with who views them. So they changed that. There's that relationship between the seen and the seen and the seer. And so when you bring your cultural perspective, that changes what you see.
And as that progresses. I was born here. My family came like 270 years ago. I mean, like quite a while ago. I mean, yes, compared to native peoples, we haven't been here that long, certainly. But I am myself. I am of this land.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? I have a garden. I grow all my own herbs, like anything, when I'm having any kind of smoke ceremony, 99% of the time, I grew those herbs myself. They are my smoke herbs, and maybe they're the same smoke herbs that, people from other cultures are using, but I grew them myself, and I have a connection, and I've been living in this house for 23 years, and I have all the same trees, and we all know each other, so I have my connection to them. I don't feel that I am borrowing or stealing from elsewhere, because it's the connections I have done the work and personally made. But I really do think that I know we'll go back to bear, a bear or a fox or a goose or a cow or whatever the case might be. You know, a cow in Russian is the same as a cow here in my mind. So I don't know if people will like that or not.
Just a different accent.
That's just all there is to
The
it.
cow in India, mind you. Now
That's another story. That's a
pretentious. That's one posh cow.
What were we talking
Got the
in
cat
our
out.
last podcast? That every single religion basically on the planet has that do unto others.
Yes.
So again, a crow is a crow is a crow is a crow is a crow. We just made different stories, different myths, different this, different that. But to me, I see the spirit of it all as coming out of the earth. We can travel from one side to the other. And as we have, you know, through a lot of breakthroughs that people, they have discovered and reading about, you know, Secret Life of Trees, that everything is so connected. If you think the crows here do not have some sort of spiritual connection to a crow in Italy, they do.
Your science has just not caught up to it
Their
yet, I'm
science
sure.
has not got the 100th monkey.
Yeah.
So, you know, monkeys are starting washing things on different continents all at the same time. The connection is there. But that's just me.
So as we
Don't
talk,
make my house.
as we talk about connections and we talk about animals, like nature spirits is more than just that, of course. It's plants, trees, and we know those are definitely connected. In science, it's proven that over and over and over. Trees can communicate through their root system by miles and miles and miles. What we look at and what we see is not necessarily the truth until we look deeper into it.
It's kind of when you look at another human being, you don't know what their truth is.
Right.
You have no idea. All you're seeing is what's on the surface.
Yeah.
So it's only logical to say that the same applies for trees and plants.
Exactly.
And the water and the wind and
Well, even say, think of all the plants and trees that are not indigenous to Canada that are now here. Do you know the dandelion is not indigenous to Canada? You know, and I mean many trees, the earthworm, you know, trees and shrubs and herbs and everything that now grow quite prolifically. That's the right word? Yes, prolific. Prolifically. I had 2 glasses of this.
It is amazing.
It is so delicious. Thank you, Brian. But I mean, even then, when they say, oh, well, you know, do they not have a spirit here because they didn't originate here? Well, they were here. They came over and they're part of the earth. And what's the difference? But that's me.
So to go back to our dreaded topic of fairies,
No fairies.
why do we not speak of fairies?
Really, because honest to God, I've known so many people who tried some fairy magic and they got what they wanted, but not in the way they were hoping.
Right.
Really, 10-page notarized contract with every possible.
Nature spirits, people don't have that fear when they're working with a plant ally or an animal ally, and nature spirit coming from there, because we have possibly rightly, possibly it's an illusion, but we have this feeling that we're in control of that relationship. Right. We aren't always, but we have that assumption.
Until
and
trees
it's been
pollinate,
really, there you go. but really, I don't think many people think they're in control or if they do, read another book. Do some research, people. You're not in control when you deal with fairies. Well, their rules are not our rules. Their worldview, their philosophy, and do not assume that because you can put a leash on your dog and then command loyalty, that you can put a leash on another creature, another entity, another sentient being, and expect obedience.
Well, I bring up fairies because we're talking about cultural connections, and for us, being all European descent, we think of fairies, but in other cultures, there's the jinns and genies and priests. Like, it's the same concept, the same idea, just in a different.
Do you remember the episode of the X-Files when they actually, Mulder and Scully actually met a real genie, a jinn, a real one? This woman, and Scully, she said, you can you got your 3 wishes, I'll give them to you. And Scully wished for world peace, and every single person on the planet disappeared.
Yeah.
So you got to be careful. And I know this is maybe incorrect, and this is something I'm gonna have to spend some time thinking about. To me, and not that a spirit doesn't, like say a tree doesn't have a consciousness and a life force and all of that. But somehow, maybe because fairies can almost, in that Tinkerbell way, take humanish kind of, they're thinking, they have community. It's just different. To me, somehow, they're just more organized and they can be more pesky.
Yeah.
I know that sounds incredible. Do you know what I mean? I don't know how to explain it properly.
We can't fool ourselves that they're under our
that's true.
So.
That's true. Yeah, absolutely. And they see
and you shouldn't fool yourself that you can make a bargain with them.
No.
In that way.
Not at all.
Possibly there are people that have created relationships over time, but it's, it's
different.
It's different. There is a picture, there is a Hindu goddess, which I will not be able to say her name, and she is seen riding the water, hanging on to a crocodile. So she's on the back of the crocodile, powering through, and I almost think that would be a human fairy relationship. Like, you jump off and you're in trouble. Like, you better be on there and
you better have a really good relationship with that crocodile.
You better have a good relationship and be hanging on tight.
You're right. It's not that we're in control of trees and all of that, but
we can fool ourselves that the consequences of a bad bargain or a poor magical working
with a
or
fairy,
whatever are less than but with a fairy they are not. Actions have consequences.
Seriously, I know fairies.
There's 5 fairy mounds in Nova Scotia.
I believe it. Speaking of that, there is, and I had it on VHS tape years and years ago. Go to YouTube and watch Fairy Faith.
It's a film board of Canada,
NFB?
I think.
Yeah, I think you can get it on YouTube now. Yeah, Fairy Faith. They're visiting Ireland and here and there, and they actually visited Nova Scotia and beverages. There's 5 fairy mounds. Well, they say if you see a field where there's a single tree in the middle of a field where there's no other trees, you should consider that a fairy mound. You might be going somewhere and there's just this one big bush in the middle of a cow pasture, or one tree or something, or on the side of a hill. That you should consider it a fairy mound, and caution as needed.
I wonder if people consider the everybody tree, the tree you see when you drive up towards Truro.
So that would be that single tree. Oh, I would consider that a fairy mound and act accordingly myself. That's always, to me, a good rule of thumb. But me and the whole fairy. And again, not that I don't believe in them. I absolutely believe.
That's
you believe in them
tell.
and you give them the respect to keep your distance.
That's right. A wide berth. Wide berth. I know when my daughter was little, she used to make little fairy houses and this and that and all of that. But it was no, that's just a child. You have to be careful even there.
So
you don't want to invite them in the house too much.
Well, it's funny you bring that up, because I was going to mention I have a 5-year-old who we're going to have to deal with the tooth fairy soon. With the understanding that we don't put the tooth under the pillow, because that means the fairy has to come inside. Tooth has to go inside. And this is a deal you were making with the Fae folk.
Yeah.
Giving up teeth for coins.
Hope they don't go for femurs next. Just saying.
Yeah, seriously. Well, it could, they could have we think of them as little creatures. They're not necessarily little creatures. They can be half the side of a mountain.
Yeah.
But nature spirits, certainly, yes. Trees, the ocean, and all of that. Yes.
What is that show? There's a show on Netflix. What is it? Heidi Heidi.
Heidi Heidi Ho.
Let's get out of my head.
Hilda. Have you guys ever watched Hilda?
I've never heard of it.
Oh my! That is the cartoon of nature spirits. It's all about this little girl who lives in the country, and she's surrounded by nature spirits, and some of them are messing up her day, and she's trying to help some, and then she has to move to the city, and she realizes that all the nature spirits that were in the country are still in the city. They just modernized and
isn't that
made it work.
interesting?
Yeah, if you guys ever want to sit down and have it edible, it is probably one of the best shows on, kid shows on Netflix.
Isn't that interesting?
Really, really good. Yeah.
I do remember even, my daughter's pushing 20 now, but all the little Barbie type in whatever movies, but the Thumbelina movie, I mean, in the parks were full of all these little fairies, like everywhere trying to stop the bulldozers. We don't want condos here, but they're everywhere, even if you think,
what was it?
you're in the middle of
Was it a Disney movie or DreamWorks?
Fern Gully.
Fern Gully, that's
Fern
Fern
Gully,
Gully.
good old Fern Gully. That's and so what about all the mice that people seem to be having? So we're not talking about the spirit. We need to tell the spirits of the mice to get out. All these people, all I hear lately is people talking about mice.
Well, it's funny. It's the whole time
You
we're
need to
having
tell
this
them to get
conversation. I'm picturing this rat standing on the corner of Pizza Corner downtown, smoking a cigar with a pot of gold.
There's so many. It's terrible, the rats, but we want to talk about that.
Port Cities.
Absolutely. I do feel that I've learned a few things tonight, talking about stuff that I just never gave much thought to. You know, of course, the spirits of all of the nature and the woods and the mountains and all of that. But a few things I hadn't thought about.
Because those spirits, to me, my impression of those spirits are the old ones, the wise ones, the strong ones, the calm ones, which fairies are not that.
Arthur and the Invisibles.
Yeah.
You ever seen that? That's
Yeah.
an excellent little movie. Arthur and the Invisibles.
Okay.
That's an excellent little movie.
So we just have to be careful to make sure, like, fairies haven't figured out podcasts or listening in on us. So, like,
But they're going to shut the back door now. They're sneaking in under the
I'm gonna go
door.
steal all or half their socks.
It's okay, I don't wear socks.
You know what? I wash my socks in garment bags. And they all still don't come out. I don't understand. Yeah, I would think if it was the washing machine, they can get underneath the beater, the rotator, and when people, my washing machine's not working, you take the rotator off. There's 25 socks underneath there, but I wash my socks in garment bags. Or what is it? There's that wonderful episode with that wonderful little scene in Family Guy when he's looking in the dryer and he says, and you can see the lamppost from Narnia in the dryer. And he's going, "Give me back my sock, you go bastard." Sorry, now, here we are, a little bit of levity. Okay, well, look, thank you very much, everyone, for tuning in. And if you have any questions or suggestions for us, you can get in contact with us on our Three Witches and a Druid Facebook page. Give us a like, give us some stars, anything like that. And I believe we do have some Patreon.
Yeah, if you want to help support us feeding our wonderful sound editor, we always appreciate the support at patreon.com/Three Witches and a Druid.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. So until next time, everybody, merry meet.
Merry parts.
And merry meet again.
Blessed be.
be.
This has been Three Witches and a Druid podcast. Thanks for listening.